First of all, let me introduce myself very briefly. I'm Cliff Douglas. I teach public health policy at U of M's School of Public Health and serve as director of the University of Michigan Tobacco Research Network. And I'm delighted that we have a number of sponsors who have supported this event today, ranging from the School of Public Health to M-Healthy and the Ford School of Public Policy, the U of M Substance Abuse Research Center, and other interested organizations on campus. So I'd like to introduce our guest speaker today, Charles Lewis. And Chuck is a professor of journalism and also the founding executive editor of the investigative reporting workshop at the American University School of Communications in Washington, D.C. And I was delighted when our weather didn't prevent him from coming from Washington, D.C. early this morning. Thank you for getting up so early. Chuck is a former ABC News and CBS News producer. He was a producer for 60 Minutes for Mike Wallace, who of course is a famed alumnus of the University of Michigan. And he founded what is truly the renowned Center for Public Integrity in Washington, D.C., and its international consortium of investigative journalists, which is the first global network of premier investigative reporters to develop and publish online multimedia exposés across borders around the world. And it was when Chuck was serving as the director of the Center for Public Integrity, in fact, that I first had the honor of meeting him back in the early 1990s. He quickly became a critical expert, and I should also add sympathetic sounding board and support for me when I found myself at the center of the largest libel action lawsuit in American history, when the Philip Morris Tobacco Company sued ABC, the American Broadcasting Company, for $10 billion following ABC's broadcast of an investigative story about the tobacco manufacturers' manipulation of nicotine to addict millions of consumers that I had brought to ABC's attention. And Chuck has my gratitude for covering this story in his usual very insightful and thoughtful manner in his newest book, which is, as you've seen, 935 Lies, The Future of Truth and the Decline of America's Moral Integrity, about which we will be hearing much more today. Chuck has also co-authored 5 books with the Center for Public Integrity. I'll list them. They include The Buying of the President in 1996, The Buying of the Congress, 1998, The Buying of, I guess, the next president in 2000, The Cheating of America in 2001, and then The Buying of the President in 2004, which was in fact a New York Times bestseller. He was awarded the prestigious MacArthur Genius Fellowship in 1998. I have known a few people who have received that award, and none could possibly be more deserving than Chuck Lewis. And in 2004, he was given the PEN USA First Amendment Award, and I quote, for expanding the reach of investigative journalism, for his courage in going after a story regardless of whose toes he steps on, and for boldly exercising his freedom of speech and freedom of the press. And in 2009, the Encyclopedia of Journalism called him, quote, one of the 30 most notable investigative reporters in the U.S. since World War I. So with that, it is my great honor, my personal great honor, to welcome Chuck Lewis back to the University of Michigan.
Thanks so much, Cliff, for that introduction. I don't know, Cliff is such a mild-mannered, self-effacing guy. I don't know if I hope you all fully recognize what an icon he is in the world of both journalism and public interest issues, I guess, in our country. It is Cliff Douglas who really helped bring to light so many things that we learned in the 1990s about tobacco, none more notable than altering the levels of nicotine in cigarettes. That is due almost entirely to this gentleman here, who's very mild-mannered and self-effacing. So it has always been my honor to know you, Cliff, honestly. You are a very friendly, mild-mannered troublemaker of the best kind in terms of seeing things. No, well, no, but obviously journalists love you because you've been immensely helpful to journalists, but you are actually the catalyst for a lot of these things, finding things that no one knew about, et cetera. So journalism is a collaborative exercise, always, and especially television, of course, which is more involved with technology and equipment and all that. So when you see important stories at least attempted, if not completed sometimes, it is because of folks that are sometimes in the limelight to some extent, as thankfully you were, Cliff, and some of those stories we'll talk about in a sec. But so much is never known or said and noticed or acknowledged also by professional journalism, I have to say. So anyway, this is sort of an odd talk, and it's an odd book. That I shouldn't say that. But most investigative reporters look at a situation and they don't really want to care that much about what people in power say, because they figure you should either hold on to your wallet or put on hip waders. If they're in public life, you're not sure if what you're hearing is true. Same with companies, same with any other group, labor unions, whoever it is. And so there's a cautionary thing with journalists when people talk. And so investigative journalists in particular key on documents and court records and things that are more tangible. There were some maybe sometimes issued under oath or after large decisions or congressional hearings after 100 hours and 37 witnesses. You know, you'll start to assess when you see all of that before you jump to any conclusions. And so I had never paid attention to what those in power said, despite 300 reports, 14 books in 15 years, 35 news conferences, 10,000 news articles about the work of the Center for Public Integrity. That's a long conversation about why I started that. I quit 60 Minutes one day and started it. That's all. If you want to talk about it later, I'm happy to do it. But I got offended at the end of '04. I stepped down from the center. When you found something, sometimes people start making jokes about drinking the Kool-Aid and stuff, and you start to feel it's just not normal to be in a setting where you're not looked at as just the boss. You're looked at as, I can't explain it, but I found it a little strange. So I thought it was time, if I wanted the center to live on as an institution, I had to get out of there. It was clear it was time. So I was also exhausted, by the way. We had alienated both parties equally. We had been sued 3 times, including by Russian billionaire oligarchs, for a story about Dick Cheney. Hate when that happens. And it was a multi-million-dollar lawsuit brought by one of the biggest law firms in the U.S. against a little scrappy nonprofit, et cetera. David and Goliath, here we come. And so we got all those dismissed, and things went generally very well with the center, but it was time. So I started noticing statements that had been made at the point of the end of '04, early '05. I noticed that 60% of the American people still thought there were weapons of mass destruction in Iraq, even though the president himself a year earlier had said they're not there, we didn't find them. And so I started wondering, that really hit me in a strange way. I said, you know, if the public doesn't really know what the truth is or doesn't want to believe the truth fully, then what happened to this idea of democracy where you have an informed citizenry? If the public doesn't want to be informed or it's not informed, then do you actually have self-government? The whole concept is predicated on information. And of course, more personally, if I'm a journalist and people don't care about information, why am I doing this? It's not. There's probably easier things to do, honestly, I'm guessing, although everything's hard, I realize. But so that started this very strange journey that Cliff was alluding to, this book, which was released a few months ago, 935 Lies. 935 is the number of false and erroneous statements made by the President of the United States and the Vice President and 6 other officials from 9/11 to 2 years later than 9/11. And what we found was those statements spiked at key moments, such as congressional passage for a war resolution. They went like a rocket up about 30 days before, and yes, they spiked again around Colin Powell, Secretary of State Powell's UN speech, which was critical to the world signing on to this, the so-called coalition of the willing. Even though the UN declared the invasion of Iraq illegal and most countries were against it, we declared that it was time to do it, and we all know what happened next. So that's what set me on this. So we had 935 false and erroneous statements. We had a 380,000 word database of all the statements that we had done. I had 8 or 9 researchers working for 2+ years. And that became Iraq the War Card. It was released on the 5-year anniversary of the invasion. I gave it to the Center for Public Integrity. I had left there, but I gave it to them to release because it was for my book, but I knew the book was years away, which I was obviously, that would be correct. And it became a big news story around the world. The White House issued a blasting statement, saying it was outrageous or some variations thereof. Within hours of the release, all the media covered, the New York Times, Morning Edition on NPR, BBC, 3 stories, every major paper in the country had this. And, but then I realized I had to start looking at the rest of the times we had information too late. And so many of you may have picked up coming in this sheet of, it's actually my favorite part of my book, which is not a good thing to say, is in the appendix. It's called Real-Time Truth Charts. I actually looked at how often have we found out the truth months or years later instead of real time. And I found that this happens a lot. And so I went back, to the Vietnam War. Of course, the other obvious major war that we had waged, far larger in terms of loss of human life by Americans, 58,000 killed there, just a few thousand in Iraq, although 60 to 80,000 Americans, contractors and Department of Defense personnel will be getting medical attention the rest of their lives, and of course more than 100,000 civilians were killed. And by the way, the price of the Iraq war is at the moment still just at $2 trillion. It's still rising because of the medical things. That I'm referring to Iraq too, the invasion to, anyway, so I then went back to Vietnam. Vietnam, of course, we find the truth out not in 1964 with the Gulf of Tonkin quote unquote attack, which I'll return to. We find it out in 1971 with the Pentagon Papers. The late Ben Bradley, who, as you know, just died a few weeks ago, once gave a speech and said, wouldn't it be nice if we'd known the truth in 1964, not 1971? It was 71 that the Pentagon Papers came out, and in that secret Defense Department history document, which is a classic document, 7,000 pages that were leaked to the New York Times, Washington Post, and others, it revealed that we had been violating the land, water, and airspace of North Vietnam for months, privately, quietly, before August 64, and that the second most significant attack on August 4th, 64, actually, there was no attack. They actually never attacked us. When did the federal government formally, officially, publicly acknowledge that we were not attacked? In 2005, the National Security Agency declassified a private paper that admitted that oops, they didn't say oops, that's not a technical term, but they said, actually, we should have noted there was a mix-up with the signal corps. They did some technical explanation, but actually, as a matter of fact, we were not attacked. The president had gone on national television the next day and, of course, said that he wanted a war resolution, which passed in a matter of like 5 or 6 days from that speech. Record time for a war resolution. Only 2 U.S. senators opposed it. And the rest is history. And that became the war resolution for a 13-year war in Vietnam that it's fair to say was never won, to put it mildly. It was essentially lost. And so those are 2 wars with a lot of carnage and massive amounts of money spent in addition. But then I kept going, and of course the most obvious loss of life. So I started looking at information as we received it, and how often was there misleading and misrepresented information by those in power, both government and corporations. And for the book, and for that matter for the last century, there's only one that is in the league that I'm about to describe. We lost more people in this world than World War I, World War II, including the genocides of the 20th century. Nothing, we've not lost any more than tobacco, which 100 million people died in the 20th century from smoking-related illnesses. In this century, it will be 1 billion people, according to the World Health Organization. Now, what's interesting about it is 1938 to 1952 or so, there were about 15 major scientific studies in multiple countries, all saying smoking kills, involving thousands of people being tested, et cetera. The British deal with it before the US, and finally the US Surgeon General gets around to it in 1964, says smoking kills. We of course, fast forward 30 years from 1964, we have 7 CEOs of the 7 major tobacco companies swearing under oath they'll tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth. And they all say, as far as they know, tobacco is not harmful. This is 30 years after the Surgeon General. One of the CEOs of the tobacco companies actually says it might be more dangerous to eat Twinkies than to smoke. I'm not making this up. This actually is in the transcripts. It was actually said. No one was prosecuted for perjury. All of them quietly disappeared as CEOs within 2 years. A federal judge in 2006 rules and basically essentially convicts the tobacco industry of federal racketeering for consciously and willfully lying to the public, including especially the attorneys for tobacco, but all of them. And it was the first time from the bench that any federal judge had ever declared that, but they had started lying formally, officially, and consciously in 1952. The same way that mafia dons meet, you know, in all the Godfather movies, they all go to a hotel and they have a plan of this family and that family. The heads of the tobacco companies gathered at the plaza. They had just been convicted by Federal Trade Commission of lying about their products, having doctors selling cigarettes in white coats. Don't get me started. And so, and there had been, I'll come to the journalism part in a minute, but they decided we've got a problem here. People have this idea that this might not be healthy. Anyway, I'm trying not to go crazy here. And so they said, what are we going to do? And so the person they had there is a fellow named John Hill of the PR firm that would become quite famous or infamous, Hill and Knowlton. Hill himself had stopped smoking, ... Anyway, they devised a plan to, they were going to study this. And they have, I always mess up the name, a public interest health research group or something like that. I'm botching the name, but it's something like that, a happy sounding name. And they put hundreds of ads in newspapers within 48 hours of this meeting saying, we are going to get to the bottom of this and look into the health because we care about your health. This institute, or this little phony group, when it was phony, was started by Hill and Knowlton, and if any discerning investigative reporter had looked, it was down the hall from Hill and Knowlton's office. And the person staffing it was a former Hill and Knowlton employee, which, you know, it wouldn't take an investigative reporter to figure that out, really. But they went on, and they kept issuing studies and science and ads about how they're worried about the health, and they would investigate everything that could possibly hurt you except smoking for year after year, for decades. And it was all designed to, well, this is the key, the punchline. In 1968 or so, there's 40 million documents now that have been warehoused, thanks to folks like Cliff and others with litigation, that have been warehoused from internal tobacco industry documents. Obviously, I have not read all 40 million documents, but there is a memo there where some lawyers are talking, tobacco lawyers, and they say, well, we can't actually rely on facts in our case. We can't suggest that our product is healthy, obviously. So our best product is doubt. Doubt is our product. In other words, the longer we say we're looking into it, and we go from this year to the next year to the year after, it's ka-ching. They're going to make money, and they're going to keep wondering about the doubt. And it became the playbook, the doubt thing, for every other product every industry has ever done in the last 50 to 70 years. It's the same playbook. The industry is going to look into it, and they'll get back to you maybe in 50 years. No, eventually they'll get to it, and they'll finally have a public policy. So if you look at these issues, they're rather compelling for, at least in my view. You have lead paint, you have doctors doing ads in schools on posters saying lead paint helps guard your children guard their health. For years they're promoting it in hospitals and classrooms to children and to people in hospitals. That's in 23. They already have internal evidence that lead paint is harmful. The President of the United States, Richard Nixon, in 71, that signs the Lead-Based Paint Poisoning Prevention Act. So it took almost 50 years for the U.S. government to respond to the real problems with lead paint. And the first major story was 20 years after the lead paint ads that were fraudulent back in 20. That was in 43, and Parade and CBS and other public Time magazine. I'm not going to go through all of them, but a few others. Asbestos, 1934 internal memos from industry executives talking about, manipulating findings about it, the harm asbestos causes to workers. That pattern of deception goes on for decades and decades. A scientist, or Dr. Irving Selikoff at Mount Sinai Medical Center in 1964 does the first comprehensive definitive study about asbestos. The first real journalistic account of any note is Paul Brodeur for The New Yorker in 68. That's 34 years later after the internal memos. It takes decades for that truth to emerge. Black lung with coal miners, 43, the British deal with it, 1943. The US doesn't get around until 1969. The first significant journalism occurs in the 60s. So we got decades with no one covering this. I could go on and on. I'll switch to government. To me, obviously, the most notable government deceptions, besides the ones I'm going to go deeper on in a second, come back to tobacco. But I want to talk about, you have the issue of the Tuskegee syphilis study. We've all heard of that, or most of us have heard of it. We have 600 uninformed black males who have not been told that the pill they're getting is a placebo. It has totally no use medically whatsoever. They're all suffering from syphilis. The Public Health Service in the U.S. wants to see what it's like to die from syphilis, and they watch them die. Think about that a minute. The truth doesn't emerge for 40 years. 1972, someone, a whistleblower, steps forward and tells Associated Press. Gene Heller writes the story for Associated Press. 40 years. Human radiation experiments at the end of World War II. We're testing the atomic bomb, and we're also doing other related things. And so they're doing literally plutonium injections, liquid plutonium being injected into humans to see what happens to them, ... How long does it take for them to die as well? Those kinds of studies those things were happening way back in 1944 and 45, 46, 47. When does the public find out about it? 1992. Eileen Wellsome for the Albuquerque Tribune. She wins the Pulitzer Prize. The president appoints a commission that delineates everything. Thousands of people had their health violated with the knowledge of the U.S. government, and we didn't know for basically close to half a century, or it was a half century. So you get the idea. So we don't have real-time truth. We find out years later. There's a little small matter of, in a democracy, if you don't know the truth in real time, what's going on here? Is it helpful to certain interests if you don't know the truth? Of course it is. Does it help them evade regulation? Yes. Do innocent people die? Yes. Are journalists in the middle of this tracking it closely? No, they weren't for the most part. They were always at the back end also, decades later usually. The case where actually most people say their favorite chapter, which tells you that they have a macabre interest in a sad tale, but the chapter 5 in the book is called Doubt. Doubt is their product, and it's about the doubt issue, stirring up doubt, ka-ching, making money year after year. And I look at my own profession of journalism, 1940 to 2000, news organizations having trouble telling the truth about tobacco, without exception, whether there are some exceptions. But in 1938, there's a reporter who was fed up with the number of times the corporate media was not covering subjects that he thought were important, so he quit, left the commercial newspaper business, started a newsletter gutsy thing to do, called In Fact. And he writes 500 issues over the next almost 15 years. And 100 of the 500 issues are about tobacco. And he was livid. And actually what sets him off to, I think in the first issues even, he noticed that there was a scientific study done in Europe about smoking killing people, a definitive study involving hundreds of people, scientific study, formal official type study. The first one, actually, I think is noted to be. And Associated Press moves it on the wires, and almost no commercial newspapers in the United States pick it up. And he could not believe it. And of course, he understood why. They were all getting advertising. And so that's why he started his newsletter. And he would, 100 of the 500 were all about tobacco, but also the spinelessness of the media, which was happy to take the money. You have Edward R. Murrow in 1955 on See It Now, the first major CBS or first major network television news show in prime time. And of course, Edward R. Murrow dies of lung cancer in '65, and he always smoked on screen. But I can tell you, in the two See It Nows that he did one that told the tobacco side of the story, and then the public health side, 1/2 hour each. In both of those, he does not smoke on screen, although his biographer, A.M. Sperber, said he was smoking in between the breaks, obviously because of the habit of smoking. But anyway, he did tell that, but standing up to tobacco with that show, those shows, and also with some other shows, he alienated commercial advertisers, and he was removed from the air by CBS a year or two later. And he dies, like I said, of lung cancer in '65. You then have, and here's what's a really interesting story. Finally, after the Surgeon General in '64, in 1970, Congress actually does a cigarette advertising ban, and the TV networks are forbidden from having any more ads promoting smoking since it kills people. And the Congress actually votes that in, which is kind of remarkable. What's really remarkable is the three presidents of ABC, CBS, and NBC went in front of Congress and said it was in the national interest, America's interest, that they be able to still do the ads because they wouldn't be able to cover the news otherwise without advertising from places like the tobacco industry. It was in the American people's interest to allow them to keep taking that tobacco money. Fortunately, for once in their life, Congress did not listen to that, and they actually passed something that was over the objections of a very powerful special interest. Now here's where it gets really interesting. From 1970 to 2000, all the advertising from TV, which was massive, moves over to print, to newspapers and magazines. Guess what? $12.8 billion of advertising moves to the print media. And as I say in the book, no newspaper or magazine won the Pulitzer Prize, the National Magazine Award, the George Polk Award, any other Peabody Award. None of those distinguished awards for journalism for investigating tobacco. Probably just a coincidence. But they were running ads, obviously, ad nauseum in their papers all the way into the 90s. Then I will, I don't want to hammer on here too long, but I'll mention one additional piece that happens. I'm at ABC News and CBS 60 Minutes from '77 through '88. In '88, I do, as a producer for Mike Wallace, we do a story about called Tobacco on Trial. We noticed that actually in the history of tobacco in the U.S., tobacco smoking and lawsuits against tobacco companies, based on what happens in the appellate process, not a single civil lawsuit ever was upheld once it got through the appellate parts, even though there were hundreds and hundreds of lawsuits brought. The tobacco companies would claim the warning label was enough information for smokers, even though those warning labels did not go on till late in the game from the time people started smoking. They managed to hide behind the warning label, which is an incredibly bitter irony, to put it mildly. So we noticed there were 87 the biggest, most prestigious law firms in America representing the tobacco industries against the David and Goliath. You'd have one lawyer. In the segment, we actually had one lawyer with one lady dying of lung cancer, and over here were 20 lawyers I'm not making it up. There's actually a visual of this with the former Attorney General Nicholas Katzenbach, by the way, all working for the tobacco industry. And that was one case. And then you wonder how it is they don't win those cases. We were interested in that, and so we do the story, and we noticed that the tobacco companies being sued, we listed all of them, and one of them was Lorillard. Well, the president of CBS was also the president of Lorillard. His name was Lawrence Tisch. Tisch was not beloved inside CBS. By 1988, the year I'm talking about, he had laid off 450 people. And so I have to say that what I'm about to tell you may have occurred partly because of the atmospherics, which were unique. Mike Wallace, the star correspondent for 60 Minutes for decades, who was one of the original 2 anchors for it, and Don Hewitt, the founder of 60 Minutes, had hoped that Tisch, the owner of CBS, would become William Paley, who also owned cigar companies, by the way. And they were hoping he would be a benevolent owner and actually care about journalism. And they had started to see with all the layoffs, all he was doing was maximizing profits, gutting the interior of the network and trying to do what a lot of other people had done. And they realized he was terrible, and they decided they hated him. So by '88, there's a little bit more backbone about what I'm going to tell, because otherwise this doesn't hold up in terms of logical for me, because my own experiences. But in this case, they were mad at Tisch. And why am I telling you this? Because Mike Wallace has dinner with Tisch in one of those fancy dinners that someone like me, a line producer, would never be invited to. And in the dinner, Tisch says, "Mike, I don't want you to do that tobacco story. I don't like that story." And Mike told us later, but during the time of the piece that we were putting together, I had a co-producer, Rich Bonin, he said, I told him to go to hell. And I said, we're going to do this story. And so in the segment, we have a line that says, all the tobacco companies were contacted. We asked them to come on camera. They all declined. One of them, we mentioned each of the companies, but with Lorillard, we said Lawrence Tisch, the owner of CBS, and also the owner of Lorillard, as chairman of the board of Lorillard, declined to comment. That was kind of amazing that we did it. The guy is our boss. And fast forward a few months, and there's a 20th anniversary of 60 Minutes, and I'm a mild-mannered guy. I don't get out much fancy things. I'm not a corporate guy, you might have noticed at this point. And so that we're at the Tavern on the Green. There's ice sculpture with a big 6 and a big O, the 20th anniversary, all this festivities, lots of stuff flowing there that's not water. And so Mike is there, and whenever he would get this wild-eyed look, like a horse that's wild, like leaving the barn, whenever he get this look in his eye, I could tell, look out. And he had this grin, mischievous grin, and a wild look in his eye, and I knew we were in big trouble. And he said, come here. And he said, look who's there. And it was Tisch. And so, I'm sorry, I'm going to be direct here. If I say something that offends you, I'm just quoting what was said. Mike says, hey, Larry, there's someone I'd like you to meet. This is, and he comes over and we shake hands. He goes, this is Charles Lewis. We're the ones that stuck that tobacco story right up your ass. And I go, hello, and and I'm blushing, he's blushing, and it was actually one of the most amusing and best moments I had at 60 Minutes, I have to say. There was a short conversation with Tisch. I didn't know what else to say, and I never ever spoke to him again, of course. It was the worst and only time I ever met the guy. But the reason I'm telling that is that's a case where, because of peculiar circumstances, the networks got it right. They actually did a story that was worth telling. It was somewhat edgy and aggressive, and it defied the owner, who happened to even own a tobacco company. That's the way it's supposed to work in journalism. You're supposed to let the facts speak for themselves and let the chips fall. Well, and Cliff knows all of this, and he was an instigator of some of this. He's a very modest guy. But anyway, in 1993, approximately, two TV shows start to do things, both at the same network. ABC News, where I used to work earlier, before 60. There were 2 shows, both not very long-lived. One was Day One, and one was Turning Point. Now, Day One is the show that breaks the story. Walt Bogdanich, who now today is at the New York Times and totally has at this point won 3 Pulitzer Prizes, which is impressive, obviously. Walt was a producer for Mike Wallace then. Or no, sorry, at ABC. He was a producer at Day One. He also was a producer for Mike later at another time. But anyway, so Walt at Day One and John Martin, the on-air correspondent, are proposing a story about altering the levels of nicotine in cigarettes during the cigarette production process. That had never been reported before. And we have a modest fellow here who knows everything I'm telling you, and in fact was there in the middle of it. I was not, just to be full disclosure. It's like having Yoda sitting here. But I do want to say that that was what happens next is unbelievable. The Congress decides, that's around the time they haul in the 7 CEOs who swear under oath to tell the truth and do the ridiculous comment about the Twinkie. And it's also the time the Food and Drug Administration decides to regulate tobacco. What a concept. The agency had been around since the 1920s, I think, officially, and they had never regulated. They never had the authority to regulate. Not coincidentally, by the way. And so what happens is they do a story showing that the levels of tobacco are altered. There's a secret source known as Deep Cough telling about how they changed the levels of nicotine, which no one had actually ever known before, this story. And within a few weeks of that story, Philip Morris announces a $10 billion lawsuit, the biggest libel case ever brought against any journalist in any part of the world. Forget the US, the world. So I won't go into all the sordid details because it takes too long, but the headline is that ABC settled the case and abandoned the reporters. They did not, the 2 reporters, John Martin, the on-air guy, and the producer who did all the work, no offense, John Martin, Walt Bogdanich, they were also named in the lawsuit. And they kept being told, when was our side going to come out? The tobacco industry was leaking nasty stuff and trying to smear them in position. They all had big law firms, both the network and. What happens is ABC is trying to sell the company. Capital Cities is trying to work out a sale to Disney. They've got to have no outstanding liabilities on their balance sheet. And the head guy of ABC, Murphy, who I tried to interview and he declined, funny how that works, the day before the interview he canceled the interview for this book. But what happens is they have a news conference, very public. ABC is being sued by Philip Morris for $10 billion. Within 2 to 3 hours, Roone Arledge, who was the president of ABC News and over all these shows, both shows, which I'll come to the other show in a sec, he actually has 9 people in his office, I think 7 or 8 of whom are actually lawyers, many of them from ABC Inc. And that day, they were told to get rid of the lawsuit as fast as possible, and then there was this other thing, and they said, kill that other thing. The other thing was a documentary which maybe was more important and equally important, let's put it that way. The U.S. had been exporting tobacco. The tobacco industry had been selling tobacco outside the U.S. for decades. And every U.S. trade representative, part of the White House, from Jimmy Carter up to today, Barack Obama, has had trade officials prying, in the name of free trade, prying open markets around the world to allow tobacco to be grown, sold, manufactured, and advertised to children and others in these various countries around the world. That's why 1 billion people will die from smoking in the 21st century, because we have exported what emanated here to the world. That's not widely known, but it's true. Well, anyway, they had done filming on 4 continents, spent $500,000, all because ABC wanted to do it. The show was called Day One. What happens? The producer who had his piece approved a week or 2 before gets a phone call from one of the suits, I call them, one of the network people, and they said, I know your show's all set to go, but I just wanted you to know we have a problem with it now. And they would never say what the problem was. they said, well, we'll get together and discuss it. They never got together and discussed it. And after a few weeks, they wanted all of the producers' notes, everything shot, everything they wanted to be sent to the lawyers. The guy that I'm talking about was a 4-time Emmy Award winner, Marty Q, and he, as he's said publicly and he's quoted in the book, I think, he knew when they asked for all the outtakes and all the material, he knew what that meant. They were eating a $500,000 documentary. They were not going to show it. And they had made that conscious, flat decision to do so. They did not want anyone to know the real reason, that they were afraid to publish that or to broadcast it. So instead, they smeared the producers' reputations, made them sound like it was not a very good segment, not a very good hour. And that was the story for the next 18 plus years. And one of the things I'm proudest of in this book is I talked to 5 ABC News executives, most of them vice presidents. And I am here to tell you flatly and officially that story, that documentary, $500,000, was killed within 2 to 3 hours of the lawsuit being brought. They made a cold-blooded decision. It was a liability, get rid of it, and the lawyers ordered ABC News to do it. And I have a vice president of ABC News who went to journalism school with Roone Arledge, who says that Roone got a call and basically kill it. It's their football. This is their game. If they want to do it, I guess we got to do it. And they killed it. So we have a story here of 60 years of the media trying to tell the truth about tobacco, not always succeeding. I even have a section in that chapter, Bob Woodward, probably the most famous, celebrated investigative reporter in our lifetimes, one of them. There's another guy named Bernstein who I worked for at ABC, who was at the Post. Woodward was an editor of the investigative unit. He told one of the reporters, the one who investigated corporations, Morton Mintz, that he didn't think he should investigate tobacco because it's a legal product, quote unquote, and he said he regrets it to this day. That's never been told before. That's also in this particular chapter. So it's a rough chapter. It also tells things that should have been told long ago. So anyway, that's the idea. So it's an uplifting, cheery book. And I'm just kidding. I do talk at the end of the book about the media, what's happened to the media in general. As you know, we've lost 1/3 of all commercial journalists in America since 2000 because of the display ads don't work on the web. There's many other reasons, but the technological elements around the business of journalism have altered and changed. That's not the only reason, but it's a key reason. And that means we have 1/3 fewer journalists covering state legislatures in all 50 states. It means that 27 states have no one watching their congressional delegation in Washington. It means we have 1/3 fewer foreign correspondents covering, oh yeah, the world. It is very serious what I'm referring to here. The only good news of that, if it's good news, it's trying to make lemons out of lemonade, I guess you'd say, is the diaspora of immensely talented journalists has moved over to the nonprofit space. And when I started the Center for Public Integrity from my house in 1989, it was the second nonprofit investigative reporting newsroom in the country, and I guess outside the country too. And now it's 100 of them at least. And increasingly, the most important journalism of our time will be a collaboration between those nonprofit newsrooms and major outlets. I run, as Cliff said, the investigative reporting workshop now at American, and we've published 60 investigative stories in the last 5 years, including 6 frontline documentary co-productions from our offices. We've done things with the New Yorker, the New York Times on page 1 about immigration, detention, solitary confinement, and we also did, we hired a Pulitzer Prize winning reporter with the Washington Post. We're literally jointly paying his salary. He's teaching our grad students inside the newsroom of the Washington Post to work directly with the investigative reporters on the team of investigative reporters at the Post, they're actually getting bylines also in the paper, including page 1. So we're doing these collaborative hybrid things now. They're starting to happen everywhere. And that's not a perfect answer, but it means we're trying to find ways to get more muscle and more energy and new blood and all kinds of ways to do this work, you know, get it moving. And it's not the only way. Another way that I talk about in the book is creating a whole new field in academia called accountability studies. We're doing a project with a public anthropologist tracking the U.S. military presence globally. No one actually knows what that is exactly, how many bases. We do. We're about to publish that. But we're doing projects with computer scientists. Most investigative journalists, or most journalists, can only handle a few 100 million records. We are interested in big data that goes into the billions of data. And a lot of the great stuff is at universities. You have all these forensic social science method folks at all these different schools and programs. And some of them they'll occasionally write a blog or write an op-ed if they can find space in a commercial paper for an op-ed that's not a columnist. And we are trying to find ways. What I want to do is find ways to enlarge the public space for this work and also make a lot of the great work in academia more relevant and combine the investigative chops of some of the professors at various schools and grad students and others coming up to be published and to be done in collaboration with journalists and actually broaden the space. So the fastest thing that's growing are actually non-government organizations. There's more than 6,000 of them in the world. If you look at the New York Times, which is generally regarded as our best newspaper in the US, I think without any question most people would agree. Certainly the highest number of Pulitzer Prizes won, et cetera. They just had to lay off 100 people, by the way. They're around 12 or 1,300, but it still does very nice work. They probably have one reporter who's assigned to cover human rights in the world, maybe, because they have a lot of geographically dispersed reporters who can cover lots of things, including that. But to actually have a beat on human rights is probably a rarity. If they have anybody, it's probably one or two. The group Human Rights Watch has 400 people and 19 offices on planet Earth, and their thing is human rights. And about, I don't know the numbers exactly, but 100 plus of those 400 people are journalists who are now functioning, gathering information, publishing information, including video, audio, data, charts, books. All that is now being done by those groups. And I could give you many other examples like human rights. So there's something going on between the NGO community, which has its drawbacks. There's advocacy from almost no advocacy, mostly information, to heavy advocacy, which I acknowledge that's an issue and it should be, I'm happy to discuss in Q&A if you want. But anyway, I'll stop and happy to talk about anything you want to talk about at this point. So thank you very much and feel free to fire away there. Thanks. Thanks. Go crazy. We all know that the New York Times essentially went with the government line about Iraq. They were being told by the Bush administration certain things that proved to not be true, and they put the equivalent of all their eggs in that basket editorially without acknowledging. And I'm aware of some stories that were killed internally because they didn't comport with the company line of what the editor and what the paper wanted to do. So I'm not an expert on those countries per se, and the question you're asking. I am impressed with some, they did win the Pulitzer Prize for the corruption being reported. We've always known for years that the Chinese government has massive issues because of the Communist Party and the lack of transparency and many, many other issues. We've always sensed that there's massive corruption in China, as there is in many countries, but substantially there. And no journalist has ever been able to report it, obviously not inside China, it's pretty evident. It's never been reported flatly, officially, authoritatively. And so what happened is the New York Times did report about the Chinese Prime Minister and his 100 members' family all getting obscenely rich. And then he had death threats that he had to leave for a while because his wife is a native Chinese. I think he's now gone back. I think that's Charles Barbosa is who I'm talking about. But there are exceptions. So it's hard to, it's unfair for me to make a flat declaration about the quality of their coverage in those countries. But it is also true that when you're in another country, you can always be kicked out of their country. You have a visa, a permission to kind of be there for a while. And then when you don't report what they want, and this is particularly makes the broadcast media vulnerable, when you're dealing with satellites and more equipment and going places with cameras. It's even more complicated, frankly, than it is, and it's more regulated also than an individual journalist. But closed societies are obviously much more difficult to report on. But what I don't know the full story about China. I know that the Times claims that they have been barraged with all kinds of Chinese military-directed cyber war type stuff against the Times itself, and of course there's been allegations or suggestions that's occurring not just at the Times but throughout the U.S. You know, the Center for Public Integrity, the New York Times, all the major media sites in the U.S. and the West are banned inside China. They're actually blocked, but because of microblogging, which hundreds of millions of Chinese get their information from the West through microblogging and other quick things that they can do without detection to some extent. There is a vibrant community there that is trying to get information from outside China. I've actually done things in China with journalists, and I have the International Consortium of Investigative Journalists that you heard earlier that I basically created in 1997. Now 185 journalists in 185 journalists in 65 countries on 6 continents, has Chinese journalists trying to be, that are part of that. One woman was in prison after Tiananmen for 10 months, and she was one of the original founding members when it was first started. So there's an attempt to cover those things. But the other issue that never gets covered are the U.S. Business interests in those places are very rarely covered. When you hear about horrific stories of organ transplants in China, that the government has got Chinese prisoners and they're taking out kidneys and selling them in the black market in New York City and things like, which is true. 60 Minutes, Primetime Live, and other groups have done stories about that, and they've gotten secret videos. What is not reported is that there are U.S. pharmaceutical companies and European pharmaceutical companies who have business operations inside China, and they are providing the pharmaceutical-related fluids to do those kinds of transplant-type surgeries to enable that kind of sort of black market illicit activity. I don't know if it's illicit there, but we would call that illicit. I think many of these stories have not been very well reported, and I actually have had my grad students, I've had about 250 grad students and upper-class undergrads in the last 8 years. And some of my students have tried to cover this. The only people that have really covered what I just said, just that last second, have been covered by smaller publications that have not quite, you have to have documents for stories like that. You could get sued for stories like that if it's a private interest, and that's obviously extremely problematic. You better have your facts lined up, you better have documents. You don't do a story like that without documents, and you need to be on site on the ground. And I know journalists who have tried to do investigations and they don't get their visas, or they're being shadowed the minute they enter the country. In the case of China, they're also being eavesdropped on from the other side of the hotel wall they're in, et cetera. So that kind of reporting abroad, take investigative reporting times 10. It's much more difficult outside the U.S. to do this kind of journalism for all kinds of reasons. But of course, there's the small matter of journalists being murdered, which is a whole nother 1,000+ journalists in the last 10 years, and it's probably much higher now. 92% of those crimes are never solved. No one's ever prosecuted. So there are a lot of dangerous things. Criminal libel laws, where they sue you not just for libel, financial, civil libel, they sue you for criminal libel. So now they'll take all your house, all your assets, and they'll put you in prison for the rest of your life for a single story you wrote. Welcome, that's 158 of 168 countries on planet Earth. So trying to get at the truth in many of these societies, particularly the closed, highly controlled societies, is extremely difficult. Look at the attempts to cover North Korea for the last 30 years is an example of that. So anyway, it's a great question. I wish I knew more about the specifics, which, you know, this is an airplane. I'm still up here, I know. I haven't quite really exactly answered your question, but I know what I think I generally get where you're going there. Back here, yeah. Did I say that? I want to believe that they want to know the truth. I mean, if you ask every American, would you like to know the truth? Before he lost his show with Jay Leno, would ask questions, and of course they didn't know that the top office in the land was the president's. Don't get me started. But if Jay Leno asked that, do you want to know the truth? You'd probably get everyone saying, yeah, I'd like to know the truth. But I'm talking about the commitment by citizens. Actually, democracy is not a spectator sport. You know, we had the lowest voter turnout in 72 years just recently, and that's another subject, I realize, but it's not unrelated, because if you studies show cynicism is highest among those who are not well educated and also are the poorest in our society. They are the most disengaged. And so to answer your question, you have to delineate who is the public, which public, and I mean the type that, you know, you have to really go deep on that question. I think that deep down the public, for the most part, would like to know the truth, but do they really ever get the truth? Most news is stenographic in nature. It covers what officialdom says every day. And now officialdom has its own media outlets, the Pentagon News Channel, 2003. So you also don't even know what's news anymore. The National Rifle Association has media publications now. So you've got, that to some people, there was a poll, and this was 10 years ago, that the same number of people thought that Rush Limbaugh was a journalist as Bob Woodward. When you see polls like that, they're just plain alarming. And it's not that I don't think the public deep down, every individual person, including some of my relatives, if I ask them, do you want to know the truth? Yes. And when's the last time you read a newspaper? Newspaper, oh yeah, we used that to start the fire last week in Thanksgiving, or, you know, anyway, my worry is not, do they want to know the truth? What I really was getting at is that we obviously have a massive problem with civic engagement in this country, and the public is outrageously uninformed about so many basic things, just civics alone, which is hardly taught anymore in the U.S. Back in '96, 40% of Americans didn't know who the vice president was. And we all know those kinds of stats are nothing short of alarming, to me at least. So when I say what I said earlier, I'm really referring, I think what I'm frustrated by most are those who don't pay attention, and then they complain about the way things are, but they don't participate. It gets on my nerves after I've been doing this for 35 or more years of trying to find out things people in power don't want you to know, and when people don't care even a little bit, it gets on your nerves. I think that's what you heard. Well, I mean, there are several. The answer is there are things to do. There is a, I mean, this is somewhat related and necessary to probably mention. There is a group called the News Literacy Project that's started by a former Pulitzer Prize winner, Alan Miller, with 150 journalists going into classrooms across America, and they're trying to do web things that'll make it applicable anywhere in America. About the motto is how to know what to believe, for high school students to be able to distinguish between this news outlet and that news outlet, between Wikipedia and the New York Times, what's real, what isn't real. Did I really see that? That was an email. Wait, was that an email or was that a news item? And how to actually distinguish information. News literacy was probably, media and news literacy are fairly new terms. Only in the last 20 or 30 years in this country we even heard terms like that in the US and around the world. We obviously have a significant media literacy problem. And just to give you some stats, most Americans get their news from local TV. Well, that's terrifying. I mean, the amount of serious news covered by local TV, I mean, political news about government is less than 1%. We all know it's sports, weather, especially weather this time of year, weather, sports, the latest car crash, maybe a terrible murder, or some election of a mayor, but they just say that he or she was elected mayor, and that's basically the extent of their news coverage. They, meanwhile, have all taken in major amounts of money for ads. In 1980, the media companies did not take in, they took in $80 million from political ads. Today, every election cycle is $1 billion in revenue. And politicians who want to be heard, actually want to get their message out, want to have an interview and talk about their message and their platform. They can't actually get anyone to cover them, but they'll be told by the stations, well, what you really should do is buy an ad. Well, of course, ka-ching. Yeah, I bet they'd like them to buy an ad. And that's, so why do these campaigns cost as much as they do? Barack Obama, the former state legislator and one-term senator, raises $750 million in 2008. Where did that come from? 2012, $1 billion, first $1 billion presidential campaign. These checks are now being numbered. They know what industry gave how much, and then when they try to figure out policies, are those things relevant in the conversation? Of course they are. And so every major issue you care about personally, climate change, I'll talk about any issue you want to talk about. I can tell you, I've been following the money around the policy issues for 20 plus years, and you can see it coming a mile away, what's really happening in every instance. There's battle lines drawn, money is being spent, and the public's not being informed well. And the media, in the case, most Americans get their news from local TV. Well, let's back up. What does that mean? Most young people under 30 don't watch local TV. That means folks over 50 are watching local TV. And guess what? It's dwindling every year. That's been steadily going down for decades. That's really kind of fascinating. Guess what the peak of newspaper readership was in the 20th century? Does anyone know when the apogee, the highest point was? 1952. The largest number of newspapers in the United States was in 1916. News consumption, paid subscription news consumption has been going down in this country for half a century plus. Does that mean that the public is getting their news elsewhere? Well, we'd like to think that. Is it certain that they are? No. Is that unique to the US? No, it's also occurring in Europe, Canada, and Japan. The oldest population on earth is Japan. Highest newspaper penetration is still Japan, but even their numbers have been going down. So we have a disengagement that I think includes absorbing information and the interest in knowing the information even. And so we are amusing ourselves to death, to use the famous Neil Postman line, and we all know what those things are that, oh, by the way, are not what we call traditionally news or serious information. That's a whole separate observation. But so there's a problem here. And you know, the news still has this eat your broccoli quality to it. People much rather have dessert, what can I say? I think there's an element there. The news as entertainment factor has obviously, ever since we had happy talk in local TV news starting in the 60s, which has extended to network news and every other type of news, everything's got to be happy, friendly talk. All the broadcasters now are doing less produced segments because it costs money to send people out in the field, so that now they're all spending more money talking to each other in the studios. Just what we all want to see is more yammering, irrelevant yammering. So obviously I already started, don't get me started on this. It's very frustrating. So we have this downward spiral on all of these factors simultaneously. Are they related to the voting and to all the other problems, the amounts of money being spent to obscure the truth? I think they're all kind of related, but no one person or one institution can solve this, and the public has, it appears at this moment, perhaps given up or is at least resigned to a dysfunctional mess. So I don't think anyone wants to have free airtime for politicians, even though a president presented that as an idea to Congress. He was told by the broadcasters that his agency, the Federal Communication Commission, would be abolished in a matter of weeks or months by Congress. The most powerful special interest, you know, the one that controls their voice and face, and oh, by the way, decides if you're on the airwaves. In addition to giving millions of dollars and spending millions on lobbying, I interviewed McCain and Feingold for the Buying of the President in 2004. They both said the most powerful single interest in America is actually the media companies because of the control about who goes on TV and what subjects are addressed. Jimmy Carter told me that the US is the only advanced democracy in the world that does not have free airtime for politicians to get their word out to the public directly. So we have all these major dysfunctions. I mean, there's not just one here, it's a train wreck of several. And I don't know I'm really good at diagnosing the problem. Or I don't know if I'm good, but I know what the problem is. The solution is very multifaceted. It probably has to occur locally and emanate from the public, from not Washington, somewhere else. Obviously, Washington is completely broken, speaking of as a person who's lived there for probably too long. But anyway, other questions, if I haven't sent you into therapy yet. Yeah, yeah. Well, I teach students, and I mean, I have my own, you could say, my biases. I suppose I have biases. My own personal observations about media are, I think, clearly for political and general news, where for me it's the New York Times and the Washington Post. They happen to be quite good, and the Wall Street Journal is very good for business, but I don't, I'm seeing some things I don't like at the Wall Street Journal. Most of the Pulitzer winners I know have left. That's a separate conversation. The New Yorker is obviously, for literary nonfiction, hard to beat, I think. So is The Economist for business news and political news for the world. I mean, those are not bad starts. They're not the only things. I think National Public Radio, the only news organization that doubled its audience after 9/11 in America, is public radio, National Public Radio. I happen that they don't do investigative enough for my taste. I'm an investigative guy, you may have noticed. But they do serious news, and they do it pretty well, I think. And so I think they do a good job. Even though I quit 60 Minutes, I still think it's easily the best news magazine show. It's still the most popular news program in the U.S., radio or TV, to this day. He's still in the top 10 even, which kind of astonishing considering it started in 1968. There aren't that many things that are still good after 40 plus years. Maybe I'm an exception. We're all exceptions to that last thing. But I mean, for programming, that's that's unusual. And so I think there are things that I'm into quality. Quality begets quality, and it's like if you consume sophisticated, complex, interesting information about the most important issues of our time, you're going to probably be more cognizant of all those issues and actually understand all the cross-current considerations and implications. And I think if you, I could name a few other outlets, if you watch them, you will have trouble completing a sentence. And and so I think it's just like your mother always told you, you are what you eat. I think you are what you read, and I think you are what you watch. I really think it. I do. It's really interesting. Young people, I sound like an old codger here. My students do not do all the things I just said they should do, all the traditional publications. They're well informed. If I give them a current events question, test or something, they actually know what's happening in the world, but they access information using search engines and other things online. It's a whole generation where they literally came out of the womb with a keyboard and they can do their thing, and it's just different, okay? But they are well informed, many of them. So they are consuming news a slightly different way. So I'm not saying my way is the only way. We're lucky with the World Wide Web. We can know information instantaneously around the world. We did investigative stories where we hit the publish button, it went up on the web, and within 48 hours there were criminal investigations in 3 countries on 2 continents within 48 hours. I mean, that's pretty awesome, that you know the world is seeing what you did. That's the web. And the web can be thrilling, but it can also be maddening. We all know we have hundreds of millions of absolutely useless, or even worse, venal websites and other things online, and all the other attendant issues, the good and bad and ugly of everything includes, yes, the web. So anyway, that's my recommendation there. I would stick with the good stuff, as they say. And personally, that's my inclinations. Any other questions? Yeah. Right. No, yeah, so the right has, and corporations have their interests in that story for the reason you just mentioned, privatizing everything. The same way they've tried to seed to ask think tanks, including liberal Democratic-leaning think tanks to note that there's a problem with Social Security. Don't say you're for privatizing Social Security or Medicare. Just say that you think there's a problem. From you saying that, that's significant, and we'll give you $3 million if you'll do a study saying that. I know of a specific case I just mentioned that actually did happen. The head of a think tank told me about it. So those games are played in Washington. Brookings is actually doing consulting for Middle Eastern governments. And the public doesn't know it. The Times just reported my former student, or my former center employee, hammered that on page 1 of the Times. Did the Brookings people disclose that? No, it was an expose by the Times. So there are all these people competing. On the Veterans Administration, I think that VA hospitals, journalists have a problem, and well, they have many, clearly, but the VA hospital, it has always been one of those beaten down, kind of assume the worst. There's always been this negative view about VA hospitals, probably dating back all the way to World War II. It's taken it on the chin in terms of the public image, and it also is generally regarded as a bureaucratic backwater inside the morass that is known as the federal government with 114 plus federal agencies. And so journalists have always viewed it kind of sort of that way a little bit. Like the big story would be that something's going really right at VA. That's like news, and woo, let's go page 1. And to be fair, I mean, that doesn't mean there aren't great people doing important work there. I'm not saying that. It's why does it bubble up at a certain time is always interesting to me. We have 5 times more public relations people today than journalists. In 1960, it was a 1-to-1 ratio. There's all kinds of reasons why we know things all of a sudden. There's not always coincidental. But I obviously think that should be covered better. There's some great reporting, as you well know, between Walter Reed and some other stories starting about, in recent years, discovering that some of those issues, even before the latest spate of stories. So I think that's an issue. Healthcare, we did a healthcare report called Well Healed, I guess it was HEALED, but it was about 660 groups trying to influence healthcare during the Clinton years. And we found massive lobbying, 151 members of Congress took all expense paid trips to Bahamas and other places to educate them on healthcare, and 5 committees dealing with it. 40 members had stock in healthcare companies while they're making or deciding ultimately not to have legislation about healthcare regulation. So that was a 200-page report with 17 people. It took a full year. It was covered by all the major media. And it came out a week before the whole thing collapsed during the Clinton years. The healthcare subject is not well covered, and is so much not covered that now Kaiser Health News, which the Washington Post doesn't cover health anymore hardly. They're picking up a nonprofit entity called Kaiser Health News, which is created from Kaiser Permanente. It's separate. It's not controlled editorially by them, but it's a separate entity. So you're getting all these specializations of coverage into, that's a new nonprofit news organization, Kaiser Health News. You see it on NPR and you see it in the Post. But part of the problem with covering healthcare is covering it well, and now it's become so complex to cover. It's actually not a simple subject, obviously. Even on the Affordable Care Act was a massively complex law, obviously, still being debated, still being discussed. So yeah, there needs to be better coverage than there is, and the commercial media has ceded some of what they heretofore were supposed to do or theoretically should do to other now news organizations who are specializing in that. That whole space is changing, and it will keep changing. I mean, there is an incestuousness between those in power and those that cover those in power, and the media does have this sort of smug, self-satisfied element because they have access to power. If you're a Washington journalist, you're involved, not me, because no one wants to talk to me. I'm like Darth Vader. But generally, if you're covering the White House or the State Department or the Congress, you need one thing, access. You need an exclusive interview with the Speaker or the Secretary of State. And if you don't get those interviews, you may not be covering that beat in a year or two. Seriously, that's how it works. And then whatever they tell you, even if it's not true. It makes news immediately, and you're a hero. You've got a great interview. Nice way to go ahead, made news, good for you. And it could be pablum, it could be complete caca, it could, whatever you want to call it, but you get the exclusive interview, or you at least have access to those in power. You're winked and appreciated and slapped on the back, shake your hands, or you shake hands, all that. So that's the culture of journalism. And one reform type, who's a friend of mine, once said they should rotate journalists in Washington the same way they rotate foreign service officers in countries and get them in and out. The longer they stay, the more destructive that force is. There is a dynamic about it. It's almost the captive, that kidnapping thing. What do you call it? The syndrome?
Yes, Helsinki.
Yeah, Stockholm Syndrome. You are all in together. You end up having dinner with them. You start covering them. You're on planes with them. Next thing you know, you are talking like them. You think like them. You anticipate their answers because you've been around them every day. And pretty soon you're all the same people. You're attached at the hip, essentially. And that explains the Washington Press Corps in a little bit of a nutshell. That is the problem. And it's not the only problem, but it is a significant problem. And investigative reporters are a minor subset of all that. They will come up for air occasionally with an expose that was not derived from access. It's all about like documents or some leaked thing or some new revelation that people didn't know about. But that's the exception to this norm that you're describing, and I don't disagree with it. And the Sunday morning shows, it's basically trot out your best line. There's 1 or 2 stories for the week. All the shows are deciding from Wednesday to Friday to Saturday what the storyline is, and then it's all about your get. Who's the get? You got the Secretary of State? Darn, how'd you do that? And it's all about getting the big guests, and it's all about promoting it because they know whatever they say will be in all the papers on Monday morning. And the full extent of their interest is making news and seeming to be where everyone else is. Welcome to Washington. That's how it works. And if you're not asked to be a guest, including a pundit, pontificating useless information, in my view, it could be why I've never gotten invited to those. But anyway, it's because you are part of that scene, and you're kind of part of the chattering class, as it's sometimes described. It is utterly and completely incestuous. In my view, you're correct. I happen to share your concern. Brian Lamb once asked me on C-SPAN how come I was such a pain in the neck and how come the stuff we were doing at the center was so unlike the rest of the city. And I said, look, I just pretend I just got off the bus and I'm trying to look at it with a fresh eye. And that's sort of how I tried. Even though I've been there forever, I can see these foibles and they drive me absolutely nuts. And I should have probably left years ago. Anyway, thank you very much, everybody.